the great honor and privilege this morning of introducing my husband, who has been has an interesting journey to how he got here and on this particular topic. But Van was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. He was born 9 months after Daddy got home from World War II. So he is the vanguard of the baby boomers. He was a graduate of University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, at a time that was rather tumultuous in our civil rights history. He had a dual major in history and political science. And when he found out that he had completed a dual major, he decided to then go heavy on the acting and theatrical end of studies. So he doesn't really need a mic, but we got a mic on him, just so you know. So how he got more involved with the history of the presidency was through both of our combined passion for downtown Hyannis, and in the late 70s, we were very involved with revitalization work and the Committee for Growth and Change, and then my career led me to helping to create this museum in this building. So when, and I had friends like Tom and Van literally ripping up carpet and painting walls and kind of creating something out of not much in this building. It came to us like, how do other communities interpret their presidents? How do they tell those stories? So we then launched into a lifelong study of the presidency and visiting presidential home sites, libraries, grave sites, anything that was related to the president. So Van has been an astute collector of that information. Hi, welcome. He's very deeply read on the topic, that and the Revolutionary War. So if you want to know anything about the Revolutionary War, you can ask Van as well. But he has been on the Mindy Todd show, The Point, on WCAI for a couple of stints talking about the presidential history. And he had suggested to Mindy, you really need to do something about the First Ladies. So in fact, he did that this spring on President's Day, and it was so good. I said, would you do that for the museum too? So he condescended to do it for the museum. He put a lot of work into the visuals, and I'm really excited to hear it because I have not heard this version of the First Lady's talk. So please welcome Van Northcross.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. That was boring. I'm going to liven things up here now a little bit. This, of course, is Martha Washington. She's one of two First Ladies who never lived in the White House. We'll talk about the other one in a minute. But she and George Washington, the government started in New York City and then moved down to Philadelphia while they built the federal city. George Washington oversaw most of that, made all the key decisions about where the Capitol would be sited in the president's house and all of that. But George and Martha never lived there. They left office in 1897. And the second First Lady, of course, was Abigail Adams, the wife of second President John Adams. They did move into the House in November of 1800. That was the deadline for moving the government from Philadelphia down to the new federal city at November 1st, 1800, and they just barely made it. And when Abigail and John moved into the White House, it was a lot more like camping out than moving into a finished home. The house was not complete. The plaster was still drying on the walls. The streets of the federal city were mud, and during that first month that they were in there, John Adams lost his election, and Thomas Jefferson was elected president. So they were short-termers in the White House. They were only there for 4 months. And they moved on. So there have been 45 presidents and 64 women associated with those presidents. Now, this is not a 1-to-1 ratio. There have been 45 First Ladies who lived in the White House. But that doesn't match up with the 45 presidents. Some presidents had no First Lady. Some presidents' wives died before they ever became president. And we'll get into a little bit of that. But 6 wives died before their husbands even became president. 3 died while the president was in office. 3 married the president while he was in office. 3 were so sickly they were unable to function as first lady, so somebody had to take over hostessing duties for them. 2 of them were not born in the United States. Louisa Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, was born in England, and of course Melania Trump was born in Slovakia, in the former Yugoslavia. 1 first lady had a baby in the White House. There have been 12 babies in all born in the White House, but only 1, and it was actually born in the White House while the First Lady was in office. And 12 of those 64 ladies served as White House hostesses, not First Lady. This is 51 of those 64 women. We certainly don't have time to talk about all of them. And of course, Martha Washington was first, Abigail Adams was second, and Thomas Jefferson, when he went into office, his wife had died many years before he was elected president. His daughter Martha handled hostessing duties in the White House for him. The 4th president, James Madison, of course, the great Dolly Madison. I'm sure everybody knows about Dolly Madison. She was the first, really, to serve 8 years as First Lady in the White House. She presided over the burning of the White House during the War of 1812. Of course, famously saved the wall-size painting, the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington before the British burned it. But I've decided, just for purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to try to talk about all the First Ladies. I'm going to assume that a lot of them are pretty well known to most of you, and I'm going to focus this little presentation on some of the more obscure ones. How many people in the room have heard of Dolly Madison? I'm just curious. Yeah, that's what I thought. Pretty unanimous. Chris, you haven't heard of Dolly Madison? All right. How many of you have heard of Elizabeth Courtright? That's what I thought. Okay, here we go. Elizabeth Courtright Monroe was the wife of the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe. She was First Lady from 1817 to 1825, the so-called era of good feeling in the country. James Monroe was almost the 2nd president to be elected by the Electoral College unanimously. No one ever has been, except for George Washington. And Monroe would have been, except one elector said, no one should have that honor except Washington, and he voted against Monroe. So he was not unanimously elected. But Elizabeth Courtright was born in 1768. She was the daughter of a very wealthy and prominent New York City family. She met James Monroe when she was 16 years old. He was a struggling young lawyer in Virginia. He was one of Washington's officers in the Revolutionary War. He particularly distinguished himself in the Christmas Day battle at Trenton, which well could have come out differently had it not been for Monroe. They were married the following year. Not unusual for teenage girls to get married in those days. They didn't live that long. George Washington, as president, appointed James Monroe his minister to France, and Elizabeth took to it. She embraced the language, loved the culture, and the French, even though the French Revolution was going on and people were losing their heads, they loved the Monroes. They loved everything about the American Revolution. They really embraced Elizabeth. They called her La Belle Americaine. She was very well received. Now, she did a very courageous thing while she was in Paris. Like I said, a lot of the aristocrats were losing their heads on a daily basis. And Marquis de Lafayette, his wife, was in the Bastille, scheduled to get her head chopped off. And Elizabeth, alone in her carriage, except for her servants, of course, driving the carriage, went to the Bastille and demanded to see Lafayette's wife. And she was brought to her, and she had quite a conversation with her. And based on her interest in Lafayette's wife, she was released. And there's just no question about it, but Elizabeth saved her life. It was a very courageous thing for a young woman to do alone. When she became First Lady, she brought a lot of European customs to the White House. For instance, the British custom of one servant for each diner at a dining table, that sort of thing. And she bought a lot of furniture, a lot of it with her own money, French furniture for the White House, and some of that is still in existence in the White House. Her health from the time James Monroe was governor of Virginia until he became president was not great, and her health continued to decline over time. So she wasn't all that active as a First Lady. It was common for the First Lady, Dolly Madison, really made this a precedent. When people called at the White House for the First Lady to return the call and maybe even take a small gift of flowers or something like that. Elizabeth declined to do that, and people interpreted that as her being stuck up and snobby and things like that, but truth was she was kind of in declining health. She died in 1830 at the age of 62, and James Monroe, for some inexplicable reason, burned all their letters. Her letters to him and his letters to her. And that's why scholars, historical scholars, have very little to go on when it comes to Elizabeth, which is probably why she's one of our lesser known First Ladies, but very deserving. Now, after Elizabeth, we go to John Quincy Adams, who I'm going to skip. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, both their wives died long before they, well, not long before, but before they became president. So I'm going to go right to the election of 1840, which brought us 2 presidents and 3 First Ladies. This, follow me here now, this is interesting. This is Anna Harrison, William Henry Harrison, who was elected in 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, that was the theme of that election. William Henry Harrison was a Indian fighter and Mexican War officer and had quite a distinguished military career. But he was elderly and retired in Ohio when the Whig Party came to him. There'd been an economic downturn in the country, and a lot of presidents were done in by economic downturns, and wanted him to run for president on the Whig ticket and beat Martin Van Buren, which he did. But let me talk about Anna for a minute. She was the first lady to receive a public education. It was really what we think of as grammar school and high school, but she did receive a formal education, married Harrison at the age of 20, and was a fairly intellectual woman. She was very smart, very capable, and she was definitely opposed to him running for president in 1840. Didn't want it to happen. But he did, and he got himself elected. And he was inaugurated. In those days, inaugurations occurred in March, not January. So in March of 1841, when William Henry Harrison was inaugurated, she was too ill. She was in Ohio, and she was too ill to travel, so she missed the inauguration. But she was ready 4 weeks later. Her daughter-in-law, June Harrison, took over hostessing duties till she could get there. She was all packed up and ready to go 4 weeks later, and preparing to leave when she got word that William Henry Harrison had died. He was, of course, our shortest serving president. He only lasted 4 weeks before he got pneumonia and died. And she never made it. So she is the shortest term as First Lady, and she's the second First Lady, along with Martha Washington, who never occupied the White House, even though she was First Lady for 5 minutes. She was quoted as saying, "I wish that my husband's friends had left him where he was, happy and contented in retirement." I'm just saying. All right, so when everybody looked up, Harrison's gone, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. John Tyler, Tidewater plantation owner from Virginia, slave owner, he was standing there as vice president and telling everybody he was president. And there were people that just didn't want him to be president. People in Congress were saying, no, you're not the president, you are the acting president until we have another election. He was having none of it. He summoned the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, took the oath of office, moved into the White House with his wife, Letitia, and became our 10th president. Letitia Tyler, interesting woman, she was born in 1790 in New Kent County, Virginia, same county that Martha Washington was from. She was not a big fan of her husband being in politics at all. She was First Lady for 16 months after Tyler took the oath of office. She died of tuberculosis in the White House, first to die in the White House, and the youngest First Lady to die in office. And now the story really gets interesting. Let's say hello to Julia Gardner. Julia was from a wealthy family in New York. Her father, David, had an estate on Long Island in New York City, and he also had a place in near the new federal city because he was a man of some influence. And of course, Tyler knew the family and had visited them in New York and had known Julia since she was a young child, actually. She was well known in New York society. She was a hellion. She was called the Rose of Long Island, and at age 19 she created an absolute scandal by appearing in a newspaper ad for a department store. Now, her name wasn't used, but her likeness was, and there was a rose in the ad, and of course everyone knew what it was, and it was an outrageous scandal. So the family whisked her away to Europe until the scandal died down. Meanwhile, in 1842, as the social season was gearing up in Washington and Congress was coming back into session and all the social activities were beginning, Julia came back from Europe to Washington and accompanied her father David to a lot of these social gatherings, and she was just charming the socks off of everybody in Washington, D.C., including the now widowed president. He was very interested in young Julia, as a lot of older men were. Even though she was 30 years younger than President Tyler was obviously pursuing her. And Father David was very much opposed to this whole thing. He just didn't like the idea of it at all. And probably nothing more to come of it except for a party on board a ship. The ship was called the Princeton, and the president invited a bunch of people out on this Navy ship, the Princeton, on the Potomac River for this big party, and David and Julia were among the invited guests. There was food and dancing and things like that below decks, but the big thing about this party, the big demonstration, was a huge gun that was mounted on the bow. It was dubbed the Peacemaker, and it was really a big gun, and sailors packed it full of powder and fired it for entertainment, and it was this thunderous report, and everybody was so impressed and applauded and everything, and then everybody went below decks to party, and as Julia did, and the president followed her down just like a puppy. And but some of the men stayed on deck and smoking their cigars, and they decided they wanted the sailors to shoot the gun again. And they packed it full of powder, as full as they could get it. Gun was still hot from being fired before, set it off, and the gun exploded. And hot shrapnel went all over the deck, maiming and killing people, and Julia's father, David, was killed in that blast. And of course, the ship put into shore immediately. A long, skinny gangplank was put down to shore, and in very dramatic fashion, the president scooped up Julia in his arms, who had fainted, scooped her up in his arms and walked this very narrow gangplank to shore. And that was the beginning of the end. And shortly after that, with no father around to discourage it, they were married. She was a good, believe it or not, she was a good first lady. She didn't have a lot of political influence, but she did have the ability to charm some of those old fogies in Congress. And one of the contentious issues of the day was the annexation of Texas. And she was very helpful with that and got it done. Now, this is probably believed to be the first photo of a First Lady that was ever taken. Everything up to this point had been portraits. But this was the first photo of a First Lady, and it was Julia Gardner. She, the whole time, she was only First Lady for 8 months. That was her whole time in office, was 8 months. But she really distinguished herself with some great parties in the White House and things, and she decided to have a grand final ball, which she did. There were 3,000 people that came. They consumed 100 cases of champagne. She was known far and wide for her social status and style. And just as a footnote, this is also a little strange. She, being much younger, her husband being much older, when in the 1850s, when they were long out of office, she delivered 2 sons. And one of her sons, Lyon Sr., who was born in 1853, did the same thing his father did, married a much younger woman very, very late in life. And in the 1920s, late 20s, early 30s, well, she died in 1889, but Lyon Sr. was in his 70s when he had 2 children, Lyon Jr. and Harrison. Harrison Tyler just died a couple of years ago. And no, Lyon Jr. just died a couple of years ago. Harrison Tyler is still alive. The grandson of our 10th president, who was president in the 1840s, 15 years before the Civil War started, his grandson is still alive in Virginia. In his 90s, in a nursing home, suffering from Alzheimer's, but he's still alive. I think that's pretty remarkable. I don't know about you. Cool trivia, presidential trivia. All right, so where are we? That was Julia Gardner. I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip over James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, and go right to Franklin Pierce, Jane Appleton. Jane, this is a very sad story. I'll try to make it short. New Hampshire was one of the original 13 colonies, and they've only ever contributed in the whole history of our country one president, and that was Franklin Pierce. And there's no way you can call it a successful presidency. She was born in New Hampshire in 1806, and she was a very depressed and morbid character. Her brother John, who she loved dearly, and her father, who was a pastor that she was very devoted to, died when she was a teenager, and it left her something of a morbid personality. Franklin Pierce was an up-and-coming congressman, having a good career when he met and married Jane. She was 28 years old. In those days, by the time you're 28, you're pretty much an old maid. You know, it seemed like she was not going to be married, and she wound up marrying Pierce at age 28. In 1836, they had a son that died, which further added to her depression. And the following year, Pierce was elected to the Senate and was going back to Washington, which she absolutely hated and didn't want to be there, but she went because she was his wife. He stepped down in 1842 because he didn't run for re-election to the Senate because he knew how much she hated it. Then they had a 4-year-old son that died. So now she was really withdrawn and getting depressed. And Pierce, in 1852, accepted the nomination for president. When she heard the news, she fainted, fainted dead away, hoping against hope that he would not be elected. Well, he was. And this is where the story gets unbelievable. He was elected president in November. 2 weeks before the inaugural in March, they were on a train with their 11-year-old son, Benny. The train was involved in an accident, and Benny was gruesomely killed right in front of their eyes. They were witness to this, their 11-year-old son being killed. So by the time they got to the White House, they were both a wreck. Pierce himself really never recovered. He was able to function as president for 4 years, but not very effectively. She just totally withdrew. She almost never came out of her quarters in the residence part of the White House. White House staff referred to her as the White House shadow. No one ever saw her. The First Lady's duties were really taken over by the Secretary of War's wife. And the Secretary of War in the Pierce administration was, guess who? Wait for it. Jefferson Davis, who 5 years later became the President of the Confederacy in revolution against the United States government. So, poor Jane died at age 57, leaving her successors really no meaningful legacy. I just thought I'd mention her because it's kind of a tragic story that a lot of people are not familiar with. Okay, so we'll skip James Buchanan. He was our only bachelor president. He had a niece that pretty much took over hosting duties. And I'm going to skip over Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln too, because they get a lot of press. One interesting thing about Mary Todd Lincoln, though, when she was 9 years old, she told her sister, "I'm going to marry a president of the United States." And she did. So, but she was probably bipolar. It's hard to know now, but the people that she gave Lincoln such a difficult time that modern day historians think she was probably bipolar. And I'm going to skip Andrew Johnson and his wife too. They were not very distinguished people. And go right to Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia Dent. Julia Dent was a very interesting person, and I think she was a good first lady. She was from a St. Louis family. Her father was a Democrat, slave-owning, plantation-owning Democrat, never liked Grant, even lived in the White House for a while, believe it or not, and still never approved of Grant. But Julia she loved Grant dearly. She was born in 1826, grew up on that plantation. Grant went to West Point, and her sister, Julia's sister, her brother, was also a West Point cadet, and Grant went home with him to St. Louis one day and met Julia and was very, very taken with her. They were engaged in 1844 before he went off to the Mexican War. And after the war, the father finally relented in opposing the marriage, and they were married 4 years later. You will almost never see a full-on portrait or a photograph of Julia Dent. Almost everything you ever see of her will be in profile. There are some exceptions, but almost everything is in profile. That's because she was cross-eyed. And there was a surgeon once that said, "I can fix that." If you can imagine 1800s medicine, letting anybody mess with your eyes. Grant said no. He told her, these are the eyes I fell in love with, and I'm not sure I would like you half so well if they were different. So he was a good guy. He was a good politician. And she was a very loyal Army wife. She followed him around to a lot of his postings. Even during the Civil War, she would go into camp and be with him at the time. Grant had a reputation for being a drunk, and it's a little unfair. He did drink, but why some people become alcoholics and others don't, there's no question that Grant couldn't handle alcohol. He didn't drink any more than a lot of Army officers did, particularly in remote postings, but it affected him differently. He could just have one or two drinks and he would be stumbling and slurring his words, and it was very unseemly for an officer, an Army officer. But whenever Julia was around, he never drank. And even at meals and dinners and fancy things, he would turn his glass upside down. And as long as Julia was there, she he never drank. She was a very lively First Lady for 8 years, breathed a lot of life into the position. She was very much a social butterfly. She did a lot of decorating in the White House she spent and entertained lavishly, no two ways about it. She was very disappointed when Grant decided not to run for a third term. There was no term limits, and he could have. He was very popular, and she liked the gig and didn't want to give it up. But her compensation was they did a round-the-world tour after they left office, and they were very well received by government officials and royalty all around the world. She loved that, ate that up. She died in 1902 in New York City. In her memoir, she wrote once that Grant was the light of his glorious fame, still touches out to me, falls upon me and warms me. She was a good First Lady, good partner with him. Okay, so we're going to skip a couple of more here and come to, how many of you have ever heard of Frances Folsom? She was Grover Cleveland's wife, our other Cape Cod president. He had a place in Bourne where he would summer even while he was president. Frances was, I got to point this out. They say that to know her nationally, what happened?
Just keep talking.
They say to know her is to know, really? Did I do that? There we go. As we think of the First Lady today, she was really the first to occupy the White House and fill the position like we know it today. Some recent historical scholars have even described her as the Jackie Kennedy of her day. But
is it going to advance?
why is this not working?
No. Okay.
There we go. All right, I got this. She was born in 1864 in Buffalo, New York. Her father was Cleveland's law partner in New York. When she was born, Grover Cleveland actually gave the family a baby carriage as a baby gift for Frances. I know I hit the wrong button. It was my fault. Sorry about that. Cleveland's law partner died when she was 11 years old, and Cleveland became her guardian and oversaw her education and all of that. She earned a college degree. She graduated with a BA degree from Wells College in Aurora, New York, in 1885. Aurora is where Millard Fillmore's house is, if you're ever in that neighborhood. We've been there. The mother and daughter, who of course knew Cleveland well when he was elected president, they missed the inauguration. For some reason they couldn't go, but they visited him in the White House later that spring. And despite the 27-year age difference and the mother's disapproval, romance blossomed between the young woman and the older man. And the mother really had her nose out of joint because she thought the president should be pursuing her, not her daughter. So it was a little bit of a touchy situation. But they were married in the White House in June of 1886. Grover Cleveland had gone into the White House as a bachelor, and they were actually married in the White House, the first to ever marry in the White House. Now, this is interesting too. Grover Cleveland, of course, is the only president that was ever president for 4 years, lost his re-election, ran again 4 years later, and won the presidency back. He was both our 22nd and our 24th president of the United States. And Frances Cleveland, who became a great First Lady, she really was socially adept. She really took to being the White House hostess. When they were defeated the first time, as they were leaving and making way for the Benjamin Harrison administration, she told the head steward, she said, "I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the White House. not let any of them get lost or broken, because I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back. And I'm sure the steward said, "Sure, lady," whatever you said. And lo and behold, they did. In the election of 1892, he was elected again, and they took office in 1893. And their second daughter, Esther, another first, was born in the hospital. In the White House. The only baby that I know of that was actually born in the White House. There have been others, but not the First Lady. These were very troubled economic times, and the president was not popular, but she was. She was one of the most popular First Ladies ever. The press couldn't get enough of her. They just hounded her like the paparazzi do today, and everybody loved her, and any news about her was just eaten up. They had 2 sons after moving to Princeton, New Jersey when they left the White House. Cleveland died there in 1908, and another first, much like Jackie would do very, very many years later, she remarried 5 years later. She was a fixture in the Princeton community and undoubtedly knew Woodrow Wilson and his wife there in Princeton. All right, now I'm going to skip a couple of more. I'm going to skip all the way over to Woodrow Wilson. I think everybody knows about Teddy Roosevelt, maybe not so much about William Howard Taft, but I want to talk about Wilson and his first lady, Ellen Wilson. She was born in 1860 in Savannah, Georgia. She was a Georgia girl. They moved around a lot. And Wilson met her in Rome, Georgia. He was working as a lawyer at the time before he began his academic career. Wound up being the president of Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University, and later governor of New Jersey. She was Ellen Axon was very artistically inclined and attended the Art Students League of New York, and actually had a studio with a skylight put in the White House when she was First Lady. She married Wilson in 1885. They had 3 daughters, and she was the First Lady of New Jersey, of course, so she had a little training when Woodrow Wilson was governor, and moved into the White House in 1913 when he was inaugurated. I don't want to go into Mrs. Wilson's bill, but she died of Bright's disease after 17 months in office in 1914, leaving Woodrow Wilson a widower. So enter Edith Bowling. She was First Lady from 1915 to 1921, born in Whiteville, Virginia, the 7th of 11 children. Very capable woman. She married a man named Norman Galt in 1896, and that was in the Washington, D.C. area, so she lived in Washington for 12 years before he died in 1908. She was a very shrewd businesswoman, took his jewelry business and hired good managers, and she was set financially and really didn't need to be thinking about remarrying, but through a complicated series of friendships and things like that, she was actually in the White House, met the recently widowed Woodrow Wilson, and love blossomed. And just not long after Ellen's death, they were married in 1915. Now, because of World War I, there was not a lot of social activity going on in Washington, D.C. at the time. But she was very capable in that area, could have done a lot. Now, this is where this story gets interesting. Of course, after the war, Wilson campaigned for a peace treaty in the League of Nations, and it absolutely broke his health. He traveled the country all over, and there was a squad of Republican opposition that followed him everywhere he went in the country to try and counter his campaign for the League of Nations, and it absolutely broke his health. And in September of 1919, he had a stroke, and he was pretty incapacitated. And there's a lot of people that'll make the claim that Edith Wilson was the first woman president of the United States, because for a period of time, she absolutely would not let anybody in to see the president, not even as doctors. People would come to her with stuff, she would read it, she would funnel it off to the appropriate cabinet officers, or if it absolutely needed a presidential decision or signature, she would take it in behind closed doors and reappear with a signature. Whether it was his or not, we don't know. It could have been hers, could have been his, could have been his decision, could have been her decision. There's really no way to know. But in her memoirs, it was her stewardship. She claimed that he signed everything, made all the decisions. Of course, that's what she would claim. We'll never know the truth. But they retired to a comfortable home in Washington, D.C. when he left office and Harding became president. It's a home in Washington, D.C., very near Embassy Row, and it's open to the public. When he and I visited, it's a good hit if you're ever in the area and want to go there. They've got his big top hat that he's famous for wearing and all that. He died 3 years later in 1924. Edith Bowling lived until 1961, and she actually rode in JFK's inaugural parade in 1961. She died later that year on President Wilson's birthday, December 28th, 1961. Okay, now I'm going to skip Harding and Coolidge and go to, this is one of my favorite, but the more I learn about Lou Hoover, the more I like this woman. She was a hoot. She was born in Iowa in 1874, moved to California at age 10. Her father was a great outdoorsman. As a teen, he would take her camping in the California hills. She became a fine horsewoman. And I don't mean equestrian, jumping horses with a helmet on and stuff. She was riding Mustangs like a cowboy. She was a fine horsewoman and really enjoyed that. She entered Stanford University to study geology in 1864 and 1894, thank you. And that's where she met Herbert Hoover, who was also a geology student. They met in the geology lab and bonded over their Iowa roots. They'd both been born in Iowa, which probably was a little unusual in California. Hoover said he was struck with her whimsical mind, her blue eyes, and a broad, greenish smile. They married in 1899 after they both got out of Stanford and left almost immediately for China, where they were doing mining things in China, and they got involved in the Boxer Rebellion, when the militants in China were focused on getting the foreign dogs out of their country. They were like killing and burning and raping women and things, and they wanted the foreign devils out. In the town that Lou Hoover and Herbert Hoover were living in came under attack, and they tried to get all the women and children into the basements, and they threw up barricades and stuff. Lou was having none of the basement. She grabbed a gun, she was out there on the barricades with the rest of them and defending the place, and when the battle was all over, she was very instrumental in helping people get bandaged up and things like that. The two of them would live in over a dozen countries around the world, and Hoover became a very youthful millionaire, and she delivered 2 sons during this time while they were traveling around and things. And let me say this about Herbert Hoover. I think history is going to be very kind to him. We all say, Herbert Hoover, oh yeah, he caused the Great Depression, boo, yes. You know, that Hoover had no more to do with causing the Depression than you or I did. He took office in 1929 when the stock market crashed a couple of months after he ran. There were years of abuse, economic abuse that were contributed to the Great Depression. But when FDR ran for president in 1932, he actually absolutely destroyed Herbert Hoover's reputation. blamed everything on the camps of homeless people were dubbed Hooversville, and we're going to get you out of this, we're going to do all this stuff. Herbert Hoover's great sin was he believed in the American economic system, and he took a governmental hands-off approach to the thing, thinking the ship would right itself. Of course, it took a long time, and his reputation was pretty much destroyed in the process. But more on that in a minute. When World War I broke out, Hoover had shipping interests and mining interests in many parts of the world. And with German U-boats out there sinking merchant ships and stuff, that was all pretty much shut down. So he turned his assets and his expertise into European relief. There were people, particularly in Belgium, that were starving to death. Hundreds of thousands of people literally would have died had it not been for Herbert Hoover's intervention. He negotiated with the Germans to not take it. Other people had tried to do humanitarian aid, and the German army had just taken it all for the German army, and it never reached the people it was supposed to go to. Hoover negotiated with the Kaiser's people and was actually able to get this humanitarian aid to the people that needed it. And there's no question that he saved hundreds of thousands of lives, particularly in Belgium. And later on, when he returned to the States, he served in Woodrow Wilson's administration, helping to do the same sort of thing for Americans. And after that, he served as Secretary of Commerce in both the Harding and the Calvin Coolidge administrations. Coolidge saw him as a rival and really kind of kept him at arm's length, because and sure enough, Hoover was elected president in 1928. Meanwhile, Lou Hoover was a good cabinet wife, did all the social things during the Harding and Coolidge administrations that would be expected of a cabinet wife. Plus, she was president of the Girl Scouts of America and head of the women's division of the National Amateur Athletic Association Federation. She was the first to give a radio address as First Lady. And she was very elegant, but no press darling. She was very suspicious of the press. Didn't like her, and it didn't like them, and they didn't like her. And it really stemmed from an incident. When she first became First Lady, she invited a black congressman to the White House, and the Southern press just eviscerated her for that. And she became very suspicious of the press and had very little to do with them after that. She died in 1944 in New York City. But Herbert Hoover lived another 20 years, and just one more footnote about Hoover. Every president after FDR, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, all consulted with Herbert Hoover. They took advantage of his expertise and his knowledge. They all consulted with him. And as a matter of fact, when Lou Hoover and Herbert Hoover left office, they had a residence in New York City in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And they were neighbors of Jack and Jackie Kennedy, who also maintained a residence in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And there's no doubt that that's part of where the talks with Hoover occurred between JFK and Herbert Hoover. Why is this not advancing?
I know the rocking chair they probably sat in too.
Yep. There's a rocking chair right downstairs in this museum right now that's on loan from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel that came out of the Kennedy residence there. You can go downstairs and have a look at it. Someone gave a rocking chair to Kennedy and thinking it would relieve his bad back. And in fact, he liked it so much, he ordered more than a dozen more of them from the same manufacturer. He had them everywhere. He had a couple here in Hyannisport. He had them in the Oval Office in Washington and in the residence in the White House. He had them in Palm Beach. He had them all over the place. And this is the one downstairs that he had in his residence in Waldorf. So if you have a chance, go take a look at it. Okay, so who followed that? Where am I here? So after Lou Hoover, oh yeah, of course, and then it was Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you don't know everything there is to know about Eleanor Roosevelt, I can't help you. And, there's been more written about her than any other first lady. And when she left office, when the president died, of course, and Truman became president, Bess Truman was first lady. She was actually first lady when I was born. I have no memory of, she was first lady until I was 6 years old. I have no memory of that whatsoever. But every first lady after her, from Mamie Eisenhower all the way to Joe Biden, I remember those first ladies and have some firsthand knowledge of it. So, and I assume most of you do as well. So I'm really not going to talk about any of the modern first ladies, but I am going to talk about one more, and that's Jackie, because, I mean, how can I not? I mean, read the room. Jackie was, and I'm sure I'm not telling you much you don't know, but she was born in 1929 in Southampton, New York. Very wealthy father. He had estates on Long Island, where she became quite a fine horsewoman, equestrian, and New York City. She was educated in private schools, attended Vassar, studied in France, graduated from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. with a BA in French literature. She was fluent in French and Spanish. In 1951, she was working as a so-called inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times Herald, where she would man on the street type interviews. She'd take their picture and do a little profile of them. And it was a popular thing. It was about that time that she met Congressman Kennedy, about the time he was leaving the House and entering the Senate. They were married in 1953. She had 5 pregnancies, 2 pregnancies before Carolyn was born in 1957. One was a miscarriage, ended in a miscarriage, and another one in a stillborn daughter. Between the election and the inauguration, John was born. No one ever called him John. Please don't call him John. His name was John Kennedy. And then, of course, as president and First Lady, Patrick was born here on the Cape in 1963. But he only survived a few days and unfortunately died. And he died exactly 3 months before JFK was assassinated. So Jackie became First Lady at age 31. Didn't relish being out front and would tell anybody that would listen about that. She focused her attention on her 2 children and a massive White House renovation, which she is very famous for. Found in the basement some of those Monroe French chairs that were all dust covered and everything, brought them up, and famous story about the day she found those. She was so excited she went upstairs to the residence to tell the president, who was working in his residence office, and he was about to receive Martin Luther King in a delegation of his, and she was on the elevator with him going up. And she was so excited, telling them all about the Monroe chairs that she had found. And they couldn't get a word in edgewise. And then she said, the elevator doors opened, she said, "Oh, I'm sure you're here on more important business than that." And she went off down the hall. And they said Martin Luther King just turned to the people he was with and goes, "Well, wasn't that something?" Anyway, the hallmark of the Kennedy administration, as far as her first ladyship was concerned, was really around arts and culture. It's something that's rarely ever been equaled. And that and the dignity, the sheer dignity of what went on in November of 1963. She had a worldwide reputation after that of class and how to get it done. In 1968, of course, she married Aristotle Onassis, 23 years her senior. I don't know what it is with these younger women marrying older men. He died in 1975. And from 1978 until 1994, she lived and worked in New York City as an editor at Doubleday. 1 week after the president was assassinated, she granted an interview to Theodore White here in Hyannisport. White was, of course, Time magazine correspondent for many years. Wrote some great books on history. If you've never read In Search of History by Theodore White, I really recommend it. It's really a great book. He was working for Life magazine at the time, and of course everyone was interested in Jackie Kennedy. And it was during the course of that interview that Jackie told him that she and her husband liked to listen to the soundtracks from Broadway musicals, and one that Jack was particularly struck with was King Arthur's song, when he sang, "Don't ever let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment known as Camelot." And she looked White right in the eye after that, and she said, "There'll be great presidents again, but there'll never be another Camelot." And White had his lead. He wrote the article and made it all about Camelot, and that's really where the myth was born. So here's some final thoughts from me. How'd that do on time? Ooh, longer than I wanted. Most of these women, when they left office, were a lot more popular than their husbands, the president. And there's probably no doubt about it, a lot of them were very capable women and probably would have made good presidents in their own right. So I'm going to leave you with one final thought. Say hello to Lucy Hayes. She was the first lady when Rutherford B. Hayes was president of the United States. She was the first lady to have a college degree. She was a very intelligent woman, suffered no fools, particularly in Washington, D.C. The 4 years she was in the White House, she served no alcohol. It was completely banned. And those crusty old congressmen and senators, they were used to having their wine and their whiskey when they came to the White House, and they were very grumpy about it. They dubbed her Lemonade Lucy. But she once was quoted as saying, "A woman's mind is as strong as a man's, equal in all things, and his superior in some." And I'm totally with you, Lucy. I have no doubt that one day we're going to have a female president, and I think the country will benefit hugely from it. And I just hope I'm still around to vote for her. So that's my story. That's my opinion. I'd be interested in yours.
I agree.
We have time for some Q&A. If you have something else you have to do and need to go, please do that. But Van would be happy to continue to answer questions or
If I can.
be challenged. Dick, I see.
No,
Yeah,
I wouldn't begin to challenge.
All right, well, thank you all a lot. You've been
Well,
yes, Mark.
I thought one bullet point you might have added to Jackie's was the way she had become the face of saving Grand Central Terminal in New York City.
Yes. There's so many things I could have added to Kennedy's, but I just couldn't ignore it entirely. It's just
Yeah, and I think the amazing thing, and I think it's probably one of the biggest surprises that people that are interested in Jackie didn't really think of when she was still alive, is that she was only 31 years old when she went into the White House.
Yep.
And with 2 young children, and still made such an imprint on American culture and the arts.
Yep.
You know, it's really amazing that she did so much in a short period of time. It was less than 3 years. So.
Totally agree. Well, thank you all.
Before you all go, I just want to, and again, Van will be happy to talk offline. Monday, if you're not doing anything Monday at 11, it's Free Museum Monday. We're partnering with the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. Dr. Alan Granby, who has, he helped the Cahoon Museum with an amazing scrimshaw exhibit, and did this amazing, more amazing volume of the Scrimshaw, some of its actual size. He's going to be here talking about the Scrimshaw exhibit, talking about his book, and we have books that he will be signing. That's Monday at 11. It's free. Are we going to have coffee, Jen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, we have. So if you can make it, that would be